Saturday morning. Good morning, friends. Well, today I want to talk about situation, what's going on in Promised Land, Israel, and this is a very touching issue for those who does not supporting Israel. But I support Israel because of this land is the land of Israel, Jewish people. And the Jews and the Arabs living together. And even that Torah says to live with your neighbor. Live peace with your neighbor. And that includes Palestinians. But teaching from a Quran, that's what it says, is taking everything away from non-Muslims. That's all thinking coming from against the anti-Semitism. So thinking about that.
The Sunni powers and the Shia powers in the Middle East. Now, the problem, of course, is that Iran is very close to acquiring a nuclear weapon. It's considered a nuclear threshold state. It's possible within, less than a month, if there's a decision were taken, that Iran would go nuclear. And for all we know, it already has the nuclear capability. And what this will do eventually is create a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, a domino effect, in which Saudi Arabia has already said that if Iran goes nuclear, Saudi Arabia will. And I do believe that Turkey will also go nuclear. I cannot envision a situation in which Iran and Saudi Arabia are nuclear powers and Turkey is not. So the Obama administration has really set the Middle East on a disastrous course for global conflict in the future. And unfortunately, the Obama people are just continuing it. We've all read about these payments for American hostages, ransom payments with the Iranian government. So many concessions that have been made. All the Trump administration's really hard sanctions have been lifted. And I think, whether or not you are a fan of President Trump or not, there was a certain stability in the Middle East during his administration. The morals in Iran were really down. They had economic problems. A lot of their senior leaders were assassinated. For some inexplicable reason, the Biden administration just reversed all of those policies of the Trump administration that were working. And that is now really how we got to this situation.
Soren Kern with us today here on the Christian Worldview radio program, talking about the war in Israel taking place right now. Soren, does this agreement that was in the works between Israel and Saudi Arabia have anything to do with this conflict?
The Iranians are really concerned about the Saudi Arabian government signing a peace treaty with Israel. And that would really bring not just Saudi Arabia, but much of the Sunni Arab world into a state where it accepts the state of Israel as a legitimate member of the Middle East. And this is something that the Islamists, particularly in Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, are trying to prevent at all costs. This is really one of the reasons why Iran is acting now, because they want to prevent the Biden administration from negotiating this Saudi agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There's something about this Saudi treaty that is very interesting, and particularly over control over the Temple Mount. And so we know from Daniel 9:27 and onwards that there's going to be sacrificing even on the Temple Mount. So I think that the peace treaty is at some point going to allow Christians and Jews and Muslims to share the Temple Mount.
Now that's obviously very significant, Soren, and I know you don't want to speculate too much on that, but that's something for all of us to keep in mind, this agreement that's going on in the background between Israel and Saudi Arabia. One of the things that's been discussed in this war, Soren, is how could this happen from a standpoint of Israel's intelligence community. Surveillance of Gaza has to be just enormous because these people want Israel's destruction. How on earth could this scale of attack happen where literally they're coming over the fence and hang gliders, and this music festival was not very heavily protected by military and so forth. It seems almost hard to believe in a place like Israel, surrounded by enemies, that an attack on this scale in such kind of a basic way, this is just to get through the fence, fly over the fence and start shooting, how this could actually take place. It's actually leading some to forming theories about this, that Israel may have allowed this. That's hard to believe, to pave the way for some future getting the Palestinians out of Gaza. It leads to a lot of conspiracy theories, because it just seems hard to believe that Israel, with their security and surveillance state, this would get by them.
Yeah, it's very hard to understand it. I'm sure that most analysts agree that this was an intelligence failure on a colossal scale. Eventually, historians will dig through all of the correspondence and all the writings, and will probably come to some kind of an understanding of what went wrong. I think, as I mentioned, there's a lot of internal divisions within the Israeli body politic. There's been a lot of uprisings in Palestinian territories in the West Bank. And so I think that the Israeli government has relocated a lot of troops from the Gaza Strip area into the West Bank to try to maintain a peaceful order there. I think also, as I mentioned before, that I think that the Israeli government has always viewed Hezbollah as the greater threat than Hamas. I would add, that United States intelligence agencies didn't see 9/11 coming. There was failure after failure after failure by American intelligence, even to understand that, the Indian government was going to test a nuclear weapon. It just goes on and on and on. So, intelligence agencies are not infallible. They have limited resources, and I guess, a lot of political decisions were probably made within the Israeli government to take a focus on the Palestinian issue in the West Bank and northern Israel. I suspect that President Netanyahu is going to have to resign after this war is over. We don't know how long this war is going to take. The Israeli government hasn't really set out what its goals are. Is it just going to be another policy of mowing the lawn, or is it going to be really the final destruction of Hamas? And I believe that that's really what needs to happen. The Israeli government is going with aerial bombardments right now to take out as many of the weapons storage sites, Hamas, their information sites, their command and control sites. But eventually, if Israel wants to root out Hamas, it's going to have to do a land invasion. They're going to have to essentially send Israeli troops and essentially reoccupy the Gaza Strip. And I think this is something that is going to take months, many months, 3, 4, 5 months. This really guerrilla warfare, this is something that is going to lead to great bloodshed, not just on the part of the Palestinians, but also on the part of Israeli troops. There is going to be a political reckoning for this intelligence failure. But I think right now there's a unity government that's been formed. I think there's an understanding that all of the internal political bickering needs to be put on the side, because this really is an existential problem for Israel. And as you mentioned really at the beginning of this, what makes this conflict different is the ability that this can turn into a multi-front war. We now have the possibility that the Hezbollah will attack in northern Israel, that Iran will get involved, and we even have the possibility of Turkey and Russia getting involved. There have been comments to that. So really what we have here is a completely new scenario, which is really global in context. This makes this really a different situation.
Much more coming up with geopolitical analyst Soren Kern about the war in Israel. You are listening to the Christian Worldview radio program. I'm David Wheaton.
When Jesus is laying out the Holy Spirit's job description in John 16, and he says it's to your advantage that I go, think about that for just a second. Jesus, the Christ, tells his disciples it's actually advantageous that I go. And they're thinking, what? We don't want you to go. Who could be better for us? What does he then explain?
That was Pastor Costi Hinn, who was raised in and then saved from the distortions of the Holy Spirit that are so prevalent today. Costi's new book, Knowing the Spirit, Who He Is, What He Does, and How He Can Transform Your Christian Life, graciously clarifies truth from error and is available for a donation of any amount to the Christian Worldview. To order this 261-page softcover book that retails for $19.99, go to thechristianworldview.org or call toll-free 1-888-646-2233 or write to Box 401, Excelsior, Minnesota 55331. Scripture commands that children are to be brought up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Offering biblically sound resources for children is one of our top ministry priorities. At our store at thechristianworldview.org, you will find carefully selected children's Bibles and books, along with video and audio resources. Check out the Bible infographics for kids' books, Little Pilgrim's Progress, and the popular Adam Raccoon set. Theo is a 15-episode video series addressing key doctrines of the faith that is a must-see for children and adults. Satan and the world are bent on capturing the heart and mind of your child. Instead, get sound resources that will train them up in the way they should go. Browse and order at thechristianworldview.org or give us a call for recommendations at 1-888-646-2233. That's 1-888-646-2233 or thechristianworldview.org. Welcome back to The Christian Worldview. I'm David Wheaton. Be sure to visit our website, thechristianworldview.org, where you can subscribe to our free weekly email and annual print letter, order resources for adults and children, and support the ministry. Soren Kern, geopolitical analyst and writing fellow for Middle East Forum, is our guest today as we discuss this new war in Israel. Just back to that article that I read earlier from the AJC, says the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, says that it has called up 300,000 reservists in 48 hours, the largest mobilization since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which is, by the way, this came on the anniversary of that, 50 years later, when Israel then called up 400,000 reservists. So this is a scale that hasn't been seen for 50 years. They are amassing on the border of Gaza. And you have to remember, Gaza is not a big area, something like 20 miles long by not very wide. It's a small little territory in the southwest part of Israel, bordered on Egypt on one side, the Mediterranean Sea, then Israel on the other. So they're almost locked in there in Gaza. And so it seems like what you were just saying, that this may be different than the past, or they just, quote, mow the lawn, beat them back a little bit, and so they weaken them for the next time, that they might be going in. The ramifications of that, taking land back now from the Palestinian territory there, and what the ramifications would that be worldwide. And then you also mentioned Hezbollah, which is the Iranian-backed Shia Islamists who are based to the north of Israel, who have already started doing some incursions into the north. So there's potentially a two-front war. The U.S. Navy has naval ships nearby now. So discuss further, Soren, what some potential outcomes could be if Israel actually does a land invasion of Gaza, if there's a second front started by Hezbollah. This turns into a whole different outcome at that point. What do you see that to be?
Sure. Well, I think the reason why the United States is sending, I believe, 2 aircraft carrier groups into the Eastern Mediterranean is to deter Iran and Hezbollah from getting involved in the war. I think the Turkish president was very upset that the Americans are moving their forces in, but I think that the regional leaders are very afraid of American power projection. And so I hope that moving these American troops into the region will serve as a deterrent. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that the reservists are now at 380, almost 400,000 reservists. This is a massive mobilization for a country as small as Israel. So as I mentioned, the only way that Israel is going to defeat Hamas permanently is to do a land invasion, a ground invasion, and really take control over that, root out every single last Hamas person, and then somehow create, I guess, an alternative Palestinian government that is more, I guess, political and less Islamist. And I think you asked me earlier about why are the Sunnis and the Shia cooperating. It's their mutual hatred for Israel. I mean, they're Islamist groups, and that is really why they're working together. They have completely different theologies, different eschatologies, different objectives, political and other, but their unified mutual objective is really the elimination of the state of Israel, and to a much larger extent, the Jewish people. So I think that the problem right now is that if Israel goes in and, there's a land invasion, it's going to be extremely bloody. there's going to be obviously a world public opinion turning against Israel, as it's always been in the past sort of wars in Gaza. And so Israel has a very small window of opportunity here to really achieve its military objectives. And I think if there are a lot of Palestinian dead, it's going to be very difficult for countries like Iran, Hezbollah, not to get involved in this conflict. So we really, as I mentioned, are seeing the possibility of a regional conflagration. And we're really talking about, in many ways, the survival of the state of Israel. Of course, we know that God brought these people back into the land. We know the prophecies in Ezekiel 35, 36, and also 37, 38, 39, the dry bones, the Lord bringing all of the Jews back into the land. 1948, they became independent. And the Lord's really protected these people from unbelievable threats over the last 75, 80 years. And I think that this is one of those scenarios really where the Jews are going to need divine intervention and divine protection. If this turns into a regional war, if the Iranians do go nuclear and they try to use nuclear weapons against the Jewish state. So we have so many factors in this conflict that are really ifs. We don't really know what's going to happen next. But we do know, I think it's pretty clear that if the Israelis really want to root out Hamas in a permanent way, it's going to be a lot of bloodshed on both sides.
Soren Kern with us today here on The Christian Worldview. Links to his work at our website, thechristianworldview.org. World opinion on this conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it depends on who you listen to and what part of the world you're in. I read a tweet from someone who is a sympathizer, a supporter of the Palestinians. He said there's been 75 years of ethnic cleansing by Israel toward the Palestinians. There's been 15 years of blockade on the Gaza Strip. There's been confiscation of Palestinian lands, pogroms on Palestinian towns, desecration of Palestinian sacred sites, daily raids into Palestinian homes, constant humiliation of an entire people. Nothing about this attack by Hamas into Israel is, quote, unprovoked. Now, on the other side, you have those who are the Israelis and those who support them will say that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They don't even acknowledge their existence, their right to exist. They attack them. They kill civilians, as they did here. They weren't killing Israeli military people. This wasn't a typical war. This come in and try to kill and take hostage and maim as many people as possible who are civilians. They openly state they want Israel's destruction. So I'd like you to comment on the moral equivalence that's drawn in the world, maybe in the media specifically, but also even more now, Soren, we're seeing in America. Dearborn, Michigan, there was a rally for the Palestinians. High-level members of Congress, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the far leftist from New York, really against Israel and the Palestinian cause. Maybe you could talk about the moral equivalence being drawn between these two groups, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the fact that it seems like in America, there's actually been far more support for the Palestinians. Not saying more support for the Palestinians, but
Christians, but Americans in general, who grew up with the nation of Israel through the 6 days, through the challenges of the Jewish state as well, and the younger generation really does not see Israel as the same way that even my parents did, the generations did. And all of this has to do with Marxism and Marxism. And this concept of intersectionality, which means so many conflicts in the world, it's the claim that homosexuals have to get it something, whether it's the black liberation movement, all these different social conflicts, all these different political conflicts in the world are somehow interconnected. So I think that, particularly in the United States, the younger generation is really growing up, even in the church, without a real appreciation for what is Israel, what is the Lord trying to accomplish through the rebirth of that nation. And I think another part of this is really immigration, mass migration to the West from the Muslim world. We have brought in a